Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone. This is a weekly class with lunch, and it shouldn't take a misfortune, a tragedy such as the one we're going to talk about today to bring Jews together. And though I was expecting to talk about what we should do about this situation at the end, I want to talk about it at the beginning, at least briefly. And that is, when your enemy does something to you, you have to understand not just what they did, but what they intended to do. And this enemy, and I'm not talking about just that one individual, I'm talking about the whole phenomenon of anti-Semitism, is directed to destroying the Jewish people and all that they represent. And therefore, anything we do to give in to that gives them success. And I just tell one little anecdote that happened many years ago when my kids were young, and they went out during the holiday of Sukkot, to help Jews fulfill the mitzvah of taking the lulav and the etrog. And they came back, one of my sons, and he said, I approached a woman, a Jewish woman, and she said, I will not do this because of Hitler, because of what the Holocaust did. And he was young, so he wasn't a loss of words to respond to her. When he came home, I said, next time someone tells you that, tell them that in Hitler's wildest dreams, he could not have imagined that 70 years or 60 years after the Holocaust, where he attempted to destroy everything Jewish, a Jewish woman will not want to do a Jewish thing because of him. That gives him a posthumous victory, and something he wouldn't have even imagined could have happened after he was defeated. So our response, first and foremost, has to be to go in the opposite direction of everything that they intend. They want to destroy our lives, we strengthen our lives. They want to destroy our way of life, we strengthen our way of life. They want to destroy our spirit, we strengthen our spirit. And that's really the ultimate response to this type of evil. This past Shabbos, the last day of Passover, when this terrible event took place, right after the Shabbos meal, I took out a magazine, a Jewish magazine, from a collection of close to 2,000, randomly. And I opened it up. It was an interview with a Rabbi Joseph Goldstein, the father of Rabbi Yisrael Goldstein, who was shot at that very time. Of course, I didn't know what was going on then, but it was approximately the same time. It happened right after our Shabbos meal. It was probably around 3 o'clock, which would be about 12 o'clock there, so it more or less coincides with those events. It was a little bit eerie when I realized, because of 2,000 magazines, I just picked randomly one that has an interview with his father. In 1973, I was just out of the cocoon of Crown Heights, the spiritual cocoon, and thrust into a new world. And it was the Yom Kippur War. And there was a gathering, if some of you remember, the Norton Union, where 500 plus people got together to do something about the situation. It was in the middle of the war, and the war wasn't going that well for Israel at that time. And I was asked to speak. And this was something very new to me. I don't remember anything I said, except the way I began my talk. And that was that I had to excuse myself. I have no experience talking to a crowd about this kind of a subject. And I said, I pray to God that I will never gain this experience. And God's response was, no, you will. So my prayer today has changed. My prayer is that this is the last time we ever have to address this type of a situation. I want to dedicate this, of course, to the primary victim. Although I don't like to use the word victim, I like to use the word kadosh, a holy person. When a Jew is murdered because of their Jewishness, their innate Jewish spark and soul is brought to the fore, and therefore they can be called kadosh even if they didn't choose to die. So I'd like to dedicate this to her memory. Her name is Leah Bat Ruvain, and also wish her refuah shlema, a speedy recovery to those who were injured. We're gathered to talk about something very sad, very painful, and sometimes very frightening because of the phenomenon of anti-Semitism and its increase. It's hard to deny the fact that there's more of it, although many may say maybe more of it is being reported, but I think it is true that it is on the increase, and that's very sad and very scary. On the other hand, I think we have to give some balance to this. The news only reports the bad news. Bad news sells. We focus on it and we're overwhelmed by it. But we forget that we are living in the best time in all of human history. And we're living in the best country in the world, except for Israel, of course. We're living in the best country in the world, a country that was founded on the principles of freedom of religion, giving every human being individual freedom and dignity, and enabling Jews to thrive and flourish in this country. And I think it would not be an overstatement to say that most Americans, non-Jewish Americans, are philo-Semites and not anti-Semites. And there are so many of those who are not Jewish who are supporting the Jews in this time of crisis. So we have to be mindful of that. And as far as the Jewish people are concerned, we are living in the best time in all of Jewish history, because this is the first time, I never saw anyone else say this, maybe because it's such a radical statement, but I think it's true, that for the first time in Jewish history, there is no place on earth where Jews live, and I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia where there are no Jews openly, but where Jews live, there is no place where Jews are not free to practice Judaism. And for Jews, that's the most important thing about their existence, their ability to remain Jews, not just to stay alive, but to live with their Judaism. And that is true today, and it was never true even in biblical times. Sure, in the days of King Solomon, you could live as a Jew in Israel, but if you traveled to other parts of the world, the pagans would impose their pagan ways on you. You couldn't choose Judaism freely. So we have to put a little balance. And just to lighten the atmosphere, there was a rabbi right before Yom Kippur whose wife was in labor, and he needed a taxi to take her to the hospital. So he calls up the taxi company and he says, I need a taxi for my wife in about 2 hours, which would be already in the middle of the holiday. And because Jewish law doesn't allow you to drive, although for saving a life you could, but we prefer, he didn't tell this to the dispatcher. He said to the dispatcher, make sure that the driver is not Jewish. So when the taxi finally arrives, he overhears the dispatcher say to the taxi driver, did that anti-Semite go into your taxi yet? So, people are outraged by anti-Semitism, even if they're not Jewish. So we have a lot of positive energy that we should be very grateful to God for, and grateful to those people who support us. Not everyone hates us, but sometimes it seems that way because of the ubiquitous nature of anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism is unique. People like to lump it together with racism. Racism and anti-Semitism are in very many ways the same, but in many ways they are different. I'm not going to go into why racism is evil, because that takes us to another lecture. But whatever racism is, anti-Semitism takes it to a new level. And I think there are 3 or 4 reasons or indications of that. Number one, anti-Semitism is lethal in most cases where it exists throughout history. They didn't just say Jews are bad because they do this, they're usurers, they're that, they poison the wells, and all the canards that we've heard. They take it to the nth degree and murder Jews by the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, and the millions. And this has never been different throughout human history, throughout Jewish history. That is unique. Yes, there are a lot of people who have prejudices against other people because they're afraid of them, they're different. But and of course, some cases it turns into murder. But that is the aberration, not the norm. A second thing that makes it unique is that the bar to be called an anti-Semite is so high you can never reach it. You could be a congresswoman and repeat the same anti-Semitic tropes over and over again, and Jewish congresspeople will not attack her and condemn her. The New York Times could publish a disgusting cartoon, which is just the last anti-Semitic thing they did, and they're still in business. And the Jewish writers there defend the New York Times. And so many Jews today will still read the New York Times and say, well, it's still the best newspaper. No, it isn't. It's the most disgusting anti-Semitic newspaper since the Stürmer, the Nazi newspaper in the 1930s. The bar to be called an anti-Semite, you could be Farrakhan, and I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm an anti-termite. You can deny you're an anti-Semite while you're advocating the worst things for Jews. That's something that's unique to anti-Semitism. A third thing about anti-Semitism, that it's ubiquitous. It comes from every direction. It comes from the rich, from the poor, from the academics to the peasants, to the right, the left, the center. It comes from religion, this religion, Muslims, Christians. It comes from atheists. It comes from academics. It comes from every imaginable source. Not everyone, of course, in each of these groups are anti-Semitic, but the hatred comes from every direction. That's something that's unique to anti-Semitism. And there's a fourth aspect of it, that the anti-Semites of the world never get together to coordinate their hatred, because they all come up with contradictory reasons for hating us. Although today I think they have found a common ground because of the internet. The extreme right, the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, the extreme left, the Muslims, are all saying the same things. So there's something about anti-Semitism that is very mysterious, why it is so different from any other form of racism. We know why racism exists. Human nature is that we're jealous of other people, we're fearful of other people, but to go to this length, there's something wrong with that. What's the history of anti-Semitism? I'm going to go through this history very, very quickly, because to detail anti-Semitism in 3,300 years would take us almost 3,300 years. Anti-Semitism began before there were really a Jewish people. Abraham, the first Jew, already encountered resistance and anti-Semitism. Nimrod wanted him thrown into a fiery furnace. And the same thing with Isaac. And Jacob, of course, his own brother, Esau, his own uncle and father-in-law, Laban. Goes on with Joseph when he was sold into slavery and he was in prison, and the butler reports him to the king and says, yeah, this Jew boy over there that knows how to interpret dreams. He couldn't even say something nice about Joseph who interpreted his dreams. But we're not going to go through all the biblical literature, just to mention that it was the Egyptians, it was the Amalekites, the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, the Christendom, Islam, throughout most of its history, and the Enlightenment. I just want to share a few quotes from the father of the Enlightenment, Voltaire, because everyone thinks Enlightenment brought a change of spirit to the world. We don't have to hate Jews anymore. Voltaire said, they are all of them, born with raging fanaticism in their hearts. I would not be in the least bit surprised if these people would not someday become deadly to the human race. You have surpassed all nations in impertinent fables, in bad conduct, and in barbarism. You deserve to be punished, for this is your destiny. That's Voltaire. Kant. The Jews are by nature sharp dealers who are bound together by superstition. Their immoral and vile behavior in commerce shows that they do not aspire to civic virtue. They are a nation of swindlers. Napoleon. Everyone loved Napoleon. Jews loved Napoleon. He was a liberator. Napoleon, in a letter that he wrote to his brother, he writes, I have undertaken to reform the Jews, but I have not endeavored to draw more of them into my realm. Far from that. I have avoided doing anything which could show him any esteem for the most despicable of mankind. Nice guy. Then we have Roosevelt. the darling of the Jews of America, who because of him, who knows how many hundreds of thousands of Jews were not saved. And then we have the new phenomenon, or it's not so new anymore, of this anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism couched as anti-Zionism. And they lie when they defend themselves, which includes Jewish people as well. And they say, we're not against, it's all right to be opposed to a political philosophy, opposed to a country. You can disagree with a country. There's not one human being on earth who doesn't disagree with his country. We don't have to agree with everything our country does, but they're demonizing Israel. And this has been written about so many times that I don't want to just repeat it. You can find it on the internet. The argument that dispels the defense that it's not just, it's anti-Zionism, it's anti-Netanyahu, so to speak. No, it isn't. It's against Israel's existence, i.e. the right of Jews to have anything. So the question is, why? What are the reasons? So all sorts of reasons were given. Of course, the most popular reason is the scapegoat reason. That's a nonsense reason. You scapegoat someone. That's true. That happens all the time. We do that in our own families. If something goes wrong, you blame your spouse, you blame your children. That's their scapegoats. But you don't kill them. You don't murder them. You don't take their babies and throw them and dash their heads into the walls in front of their mothers before killing the mother. You don't do those things just because you're looking for a scapegoat. That may be something that provokes and ignites the spark of hatred, but it's not the cause of the hatred. Economic reasons are not the cause of the hatred. Is it jealousy? Yes, there's a lot of jealousy involved, but because you're jealous of someone doesn't mean that you're going to go out. How many people do you know go out and advocate the murder of all the people who have something that I don't have? It's not normal. So that's the next theory. It's not normal. It's an illness. We all agree it's an illness. It's a terrible sickness. But that doesn't explain. What's the word in medicine they use for an illness that we don't know what the reason for it is? What? Idiopathic. Okay, it's an idiopathic illness. It's an illness, but we don't know what the reason for the illness is. So we have to resort to something more substantive, something more deep, and something more spiritual. In the book written by Joseph Telushkin and Dennis Prager, Why the Jews, he goes through all the theories and debunks them and shows that they're not really the reason. And he proposes, and I think what he says is true, although I'd like to add a little bit to it, and that the reason for anti-Semitism is threefold. Number one, God. Number two, Torah. Number three, Israel. That's it. Those three things. We brought the idea of one God to the world, and we destroyed all other gods. We said, no, all the other gods are false. In pagan society, you had your God or gods, and you respected the right of others to worship their gods. And yeah, your God is good for you, my God is good for me, and then when someone conquers you, you change gods. That was a norm, that everyone accepted the reality that there are many gods and many possibilities for gods. And the reason for that is because pagan gods were created in people's image. Our God, we were created in God's image. But they are created by themselves, and they can create any god that they want to further their own feelings, their own ideas, and their own activities. So they couldn't tolerate the idea that we demolish their gods. Abraham was the first iconoclast, not just figuratively, but even literally. He broke the idols. And since Abraham, we have never changed. We're constantly destroying the idols and exposing the idolatry. And that's true. Idolatry is not just a thing of the past, pagan idolatry. Today, there's another idolatry, worship of secular humanism, worship of science. As Jews, we respect science because it's God's instrument. And we therefore follow science because God created nature, and therefore nature has a divine imprimatur to it. But we don't deify nature, and we don't deify science. But that's the new God. And Judaism says, no, that is not a God that we follow. We use science as a tool, as an instrument. So we're destroying gods. And then our way of life, the Torah, is so different from everything. We had a day of rest when the rest of the world were laughing at us. The Greeks and the Romans were ridiculing us for having Shabbos. And we maintained our Shabbos. We maintained our differences. We had different food. We set ourselves apart. Wherever we are, we never assimilate. But of course, there are Jews who do assimilate. And the anti-Semite says, you're lying. That's not who you are. We know you're different, and we hate you because you're different, and you can never be the same. But one way or another, it's the different lifestyle of the Jew that doesn't change no matter where he or she lives. And the third thing is our nationhood. There's something about us that's really unnerving and disconcerting to so many people in the world, that the Jewish people, as fractious as they are, as all the jokes about 2 Jews, 3 opinions, 2 synagogues, one you go to on the deserted island, and one that you'll never step foot in. All these jokes, but there's an underlying unity that mystifies them. You're so different, and yet you're so much the same. I once taught a class at UB about the Holocaust, in which I was talking about some of the lessons of the Holocaust, and I said, just like in evil, they lumped all Jews together, we also have to live as one people and respect our own unity, that all Jews are really connected. And I meant that, of course, in a spiritual way. So there was a Japanese woman who was auditing my class. I assume her husband was a visiting professor. And with a very serious look on her face, she raises her hand and says, Rabbi, isn't it true when there's a crisis, there's a button that you push and all the Jews of the world get together? That was before the internet. So I thought it was a joke, so I laughed. And then I see she's still very serious. I said, are you serious? And she says, yeah, that's what I heard. I said, if only we had that button, that would be great. But there's a certain sense that there is that button, because it's true, there is that button. We don't necessarily know how to push it and where to find it, but we know that it's there. There's a certain unity that, this is a story that I told so many times, and right after the 6-Day War, I was a student, and I traveled to Springfield, Illinois to visit Jewish homes. I come to the rabbi, and I asked the rabbi to give me addresses of people that he thinks I should speak to about Judaism. We're taking the pulse of Jewry in Springfield, did I say, not Massachusetts, Illinois, Springfield, Illinois. And the rabbi goes down his telephone list, his Rolodex, for those people who are a certain age would know what I'm talking about. And he's mentioning the names, then he comes to a name and he says, Gingold. No, don't go to him, don't bother, let's go to the next one. I said, 1 second, why not? He says, because he doesn't believe in anything, he hasn't shown up in a synagogue in decades. So I said, that's exactly the guy I want to visit. Why do I want to visit someone who comes to shul? So I go to his house, and he's bragging to me how un-Jewish he is, that he has never stepped foot in a synagogue in who knows how many decades. He was a man about in his 60s or 70s, very young man, and that is very young. So he's talking about how he goes to church. While he's an agnostic, he doesn't really believe in God. He doesn't know if he believes, he probably doesn't believe. And he's talking more and more about how he's not interested in Judaism at all. So we changed the subject, and we started talking about current events. Well, current events, this is in June of 67, or July of 67. And then he says to me, you know what, as soon as the 6-Day War broke out, I took a flight to New York, I gathered all my business associates, this was a very wealthy man, and I donated $50,000 to Israel. And he got all his colleagues, business people, to donate likewise. Now, $50,000 in 1967 is something like, what is it, $500,000 today? It's a hefty amount. It takes me at least 2 days to make that. So, here's a man who professes to have no connection to Judaism. Nothing. Zero. He's not part of the Jewish community. Doesn't even come to a Jewish event. He feels more at home with Christians and churches. And yet, when there was a crisis, that spark of Jewishness came out into the open, and he was prepared to go to the extreme in his mind to help save Israel. So the Jewish people have this unity that's unnerving to a lot of people. They can't tolerate it, and it's manifested even more with regard to Israel. When they see the way Jews of the entire world, although I'm tragically it's waning, the support for Israel among Jews. But there's still enough of it to make them feel there's something very mysterious about you. You don't respect our gods, you don't respect our way of life, and you don't respect our ability to assimilate you into us. Now, it doesn't mean that we're separate, that we don't engage in what everyone else engages in. We're engaged in business, we're engaged in academia, we're engaged in the professions. We are just as much part of society as everyone else, and yet we remain apart. That's what's intriguing to some, but it's also very scary to others. And that's exactly the story of Jacob, who puts on the garments of Esau. And Esau is very upset because he took his blessings, because that's exactly what the Jew is. On one hand, he wears the garments of Esau. He acts like everyone else because there's nothing wrong with a Jew being a doctor, a lawyer, professor, a laborer, or anything else that any other profession. But at the same time, there's a sense that the Jew has a higher purpose, and that's unnerving. So that's his theory. Then, of course, there's the idea of the chosen people, that Jews consider themselves to be better than everyone else. They're chosen, because it's a misunderstanding, a misconception of the word chosen. So what do many Jews do? They say, no, we're not chosen, we don't believe in that anymore. It doesn't really mean that we're chosen. We're not chosen, we're just like everyone else. And the anti-Semite says, don't lie to me. I know you're different. I know you're chosen. But they interpret it in a negative way. So by denying it, it doesn't help us at all. But what does it really mean to be the chosen people? So I'm going to go into a very brief definition of chosen people that the non-Jew feels, the anti-Semite feels, the Jew has to understand it as well. If we have to define what is a Jew, it's one of the most difficult things to define. It's undefinable to most people, because is a Jew a member of a language group? No, we speak all different languages. Most Jews don't speak Hebrew, although it's changing with Israel, but it's still not the majority of Jews speaking Hebrew. Is it an ethnicity? No, we have so many different ethnicities. Yemenite Jews, Polish Jews, Russian Jews, American Jews, French Jews. We're totally different ethnically. Is it our religion? That's a great part of being a Jew, but most Jews today do not observe the religion the way it's spelled out in the Torah. So, are they not Jewish? We'd be the last people to say that they're not Jewish because they don't practice Judaism. We consider them to be Jewish even if they're atheists, even if they're anti-Semites. Unfortunately, we have our own. I would still not consider them less of a Jew than Moses, the greatest Jew. So it's not the religion, it's not the geography. Most Jews do not live in one place, although that's changing. Israel's becoming the most populous Jewish place on earth, more than American Jews. But still, the majority of Jews do not live in Israel. So what are we? We're not an ethnicity, we're not a language, we're not a religion, we're not a nationality, because we don't all live in the same country. So how do you define the word Jew? So everyone will say, well, Jew, you're a member of a people. What does that mean? That's just a way of avoiding giving it a more specific definition. So this is the definition that is based on Jewish tradition, but it's never been formulated to most people, and most people will not be able to answer this question because it hasn't been presented. At least I haven't seen it being presented properly and succinctly. The definition of a Jew, and it takes a few sentences to explain it, is someone who was chosen by God with a special mission. And in order to fulfill that mission, they had to be given special resources, which in our terminology, in our vocabulary, we call that a neshama, a Jewish soul, which means if you have a job, if you want to be given a mission to be a doctor, to heal people, you have to be given the ability to heal. You have to have the talent, you have to have the knowledge. You have to have the stamina if you want to become a Olympic competitor. You can't just say, well, I want to be an Olympic. You have to have the stamina. You have to train for it. So we were given the special resources, and one of those resources required that we are an immortal people. We cannot be destroyed. And that's the message to our enemies that we have to keep on repeating. You're going to go into the ash heap of history together with Turquemada, with Hitler, with Antiochus, with Pharaoh. and we're going to endure and live on forever, because our mission is never going to be completed, so we have to be around to complete the mission. So we were chosen for a special mission. Every human being was chosen for a divine mission. There is no such thing as a human being who was created for no good reason, who is superfluous. The general reason, and here I'm going to say something that is going to go against what you've been taught by most rabbis, and that is that you've been taught that we're here for tikkun olam. Jews were not put here for tikkun olam. That is what humanity was put here. Jews are not here for tikkun olam any more than any other human being. Everyone is chosen to make this world, to perfect this world, that it should not be an uncivilized world. And God gave humanity 7 Noahide commandments that will ensure the civilization of this world will endure. That is the mission of every human being. The Jewish people were given another mission in addition to Tikkun Olam, and that is to not just fix the world. Fixing implies there's something wrong, you fix it. But it's to decorate the world, enhance the world, sanctify the world, elevate the world. And that we do through all of the 613 commandments that we were given. So that's our mission, and for that we were given special resources. That means anyone who was a Jew by birth or by proper conversion has that neshama, that special soul that gives them. And anyone who wants to join, it's like the special forces. You have special training and you have special requirements and greater liabilities and greater rewards perhaps, but you have to want to be part of it. If you want to be part of it and you're willing to undertake this greater challenge, then you are endowed with that special soul. That's what you were chosen. You were chosen to be a servant to humanity, to the universe, to make the world the way God wanted it to be. But because the non-Jew senses that we're chosen, they can't tolerate it. And I'm talking about the extreme, fringe non-Jew. I'm not lumping together all people. And especially in modern times, we come to a point where majority, at least in America, the majority of Americans are not anti-Semites. And that is something that is unique, because if you go back 100, 200 years, the majority of humanity who knew what Jews are were anti-Jewish. But that has changed, thank God. So, hatred has increased recently. And I think the spiritual reason for it is, and that is because we are at the point where the mission statement, as one president once said, wrongly, mission accomplished. But we could say that we are about to say mission accomplished. The world is at the highest point it has ever been, which sounds radical. How could you say that? There's so much terrible things going on, so many terrible things going on in the world, because as the Rebbe would emphasize over and over again, the good is cumulative. All the good of every human being since the beginning of time is here today, but it's beneath the surface. In order to give us free choice, the evil is right in front of our eyes, is glaring, it's in the newspapers, it's headlines. The good you have to find somewhere buried on page 74 in the left column somewhere. You'll find something about the good. But the good is much deeper. It's deeper, it's more powerful, but it's not visible. The evil is visible, it's in your face. And that's why we're seeing more of it, because when the evil forces of the world sense that it's going to soon go out of business, it puts up its last stand. It says, it's now or never. We better show our face to try to abort the process of redemption, of bringing the world to its intended state, which is the Messianic age. That's why I think the spiritual reason why we're seeing more of this evil. So how do we respond to it? Now, it's not an accident. When did this terrible event happen? It happened on the last day of Passover, when we read, the only time in the year when the Haftorah, the prophetic reading, is about Mashiach, about his qualifications, about his activities, about the changes in the world that will happen. And just on that day when we focus, and it's considered custom, we eat a special meal called Mashiach's meal, just on that day, this terrible evil occurs that rattled the whole world. The whole world was glued to this. This is unique times when something happens to a Jew in one place of the world, the whole world knows about it, and it shook up society, civilized society. I think because it's telling us in a certain way, you have to do the last things that you have to do to get rid of that final vestige of evil and to bring about this final redemption. So the question is, how do we do it? So the first thing we have to know is what they want, we have to make sure they don't get. They want a reduction of Jewish life, we have an increase of Jewish life. Sure, we need security and we need self-defense. When Moses killed the Egyptian who was torturing a Jew, there's a midrash that says that what did he use? What weapon did he use to kill him? It doesn't say in the Torah. So one version in the midrash says he used his fists, his bare fist. Another one said he used a shovel. I guess there was shovels around. People were building, so he grabbed a shovel and hit him over the head. Another version says, no, he used his mouth. He used God's name. The power of God's name just got the Egyptian murderer, would-be murderer, to drop dead. So I once heard from Rabbi Jacobson, a famous Chabad orator, who said that these are really three metaphors. Three metaphors are, when you deal with an anti-Semite who wants to kill you, who wants to torture you, you have three different ways of dealing with it. And you need all three. Number one, the fist. You have to defend yourself. If, God forbid, someone comes in, it should never happen, but if you see someone who's about to kill you and you have a gun, by all means, use it if you know how to use it and get rid of that guy. You have to use the fist. You can't wait for other things. But then you have to use the shovel. The shovel is a symbol of building. You have to keep on building. He wants to demolish a building of 2 stories. You build a building of 6 stories. Literally and figuratively. And the third thing is the name of God. The Torah is called one of God's names. God has a long name. The whole Torah is one long name. God's commandments are considered to be manifestations of His name. By living a Torah and mitzvahs life, by lighting a Shabbos candle before Shabbos, by putting on tefillin. By the way, everyone talks about Jewish pride. What's the greatest manifestation of pride that a human being can have, which we don't have these days? And that is, what does a king do to show that he's a king? What does he wear? He wears a crown. Well, tefillin, the Zohar says, is our crown. That's the way we say to the world, and we say to ourselves, we are royalty. We are very special, so let's act royal. So let's act royal and keep our tefillin on every weekday. We should wear tefillin, and the women should light Shabbos candles, because they want to bring darkness, we bring light. And I can go through 613 commandments, but you don't want me to do that right now, so I won't. But you could just ask your local rabbi to tell you what the 613, you choose one that you haven't been doing or haven't been doing enough and do it more of it. Of course, acts of cruelty require the opposite, acts of kindness, acts of goodness and kindness. So for every act of cruelty that we confronted, one more act of kindness at least will be done. That's how we respond to this type of evil. And God should help that this should be the last time we need to talk about this, and we should only see the world changing, and everything will happen in a positive way. We shouldn't have to learn lessons from the negative. I just wanted to add something that I left out, and that is, I didn't leave it out. I actually mentioned the poor reaction of society to open anti-Semitism, somehow defending it. And one of the defenses is that you can't be a racist if you don't have power. And that's the excuse for all the people who, and what you're doing is you're enabling more racism, you're enabling more anti-Semitism by using that argument. Anytime one person, weak or strong, expresses words of hatred or acts of hatred towards another, it makes no difference if they're weak. This is a false, I think it's a false idol. The false idol is of the underdogism, I call it. The idol of underdogism. What do I mean by that? If you see someone fighting and you see John knocking down David to the ground, well, who do you take up for? David. He's the underdog, which is right. John instigated the fight, he initiated it, he knocks him down. Now David gets up, and John turns away for a second, and David just gives him a karate chop, and he knocks him down. Okay, now I have to be on John's side, because he's the underdog now. Does that make sense? Does it? No, it doesn't make sense. But that's exactly the way the world is behaving. Up until the Six-Day War, the most liberal elements of society loved Israel because Israel was the underdog. The minute the Six-Day War was won and Israel became the more powerful force, in spite of the fact that everyone around wanted to annihilate men, women, and children, all of a sudden Israel became the villain, became the Goliath. And the rest of the Arabs who were bent on destruction of Israel became the Davids. And that has persisted to this day. They cannot accept the fact that sometimes the weaker one could become strong. So when you see a minority who spews anti-Semitism, and you say, well, you can't call him an anti-Semite because he doesn't have any power. First of all, if you're in Congress, I think you have power. How many Congress people are in this room? Not even one, okay? But there are two, at least two, if not three, who are, and more, who defend the anti-Semite, who have power, tremendous power, and they're defended because they're minorities. They can't really be accused of having racist or anti-Semitic tendencies. So that's a false god that we have to get rid of. There's been tremendous amount of anti-Semitism coming from every direction. I told this story many times also. My father, of blessed memory, was invited by JFK to the White House as a national religious figure. My father was the president of the Rabbinical Alliance of America, and he was then convening religious leaders from the entire country to discuss civil rights. And before my father went, he asked the Rebbe what he should say if he's asked to speak. And the Rebbe says, don't speak, but submit your remarks in writing. I guess the reason for that is words can be distorted when you speak. People report them the wrong way, and who knows what that can do. And when it's in writing, it's there for posterity. And tell them in your writing that we know what it is to be slaves, because we were slaves in the land of Egypt, which is, of course, the biblical quote. But you should also report that Jews always find themselves in the middle between any two forces that are fighting with each other. And this is true throughout history. The Jews were always blamed by each side of being disloyal, and they were attacked by both sides. They used to tell this joke that when there are two landowners, each one had a Jewish manager, when one persecuted his Jewish manager, the other one said, that's a terrible thing. I'm going to take revenge. I'm going to persecute my Jewish manager. That was a joke, but it has a lot of truth to it. So my father walked into the White House, and he saw how true the Rebbe's words rang, because there were Jewish speakers representing Jewish organizations, and he looked at the faces of both sides, the whites and the blacks. The whites, who were, many of them were supremacists, were bigots, racist, were looking at the Jews, with the Jewish speakers, with such contempt. You could see that in their eyes, you could see that in their faces, the grimaces. And then he looked at the black leadership, and he saw the same feelings, and he interpreted that to mean, why are you so patronizing to us? Why are you making us sound like we're incapable of helping ourselves? We need your help. Both sides. And you know what? I've been a victim of black anti-Semitism just recently, within the last year, 2 incidents. Haven't been reported because it wasn't really serious in one way. In one incident at the wedding of my daughter, less than a year ago, we were taking pictures in front of 770 Eastern Parkway, and a African American walks by and says, you could celebrate now because you're not going to be around much longer. And then another incident a few months after that, I'm walking at night on the sidewalk, plenty of room to go by. This black fellow goes by and says, what do you think you are? You're in Israel where you own the sidewalk? So of course those are tropes, anti-Semitic tropes, that Jews try to take over everything, and that Jews ought to be annihilated. That's exactly what was going on. Just a Chabad rabbi was attacked, almost physically attacked, by a black man here in Manhattan. So anyone who says that anti-Semitism is coming from one direction is making a serious mistake, because it's coming from every direction. Again, from the right, from the left, from the center. There was a Holocaust survivor, Mr. Eisen. Some of you may have known him. Wonderful Bill Eisen, a sweet man, one of the most beautiful people that I knew. And I remember he was always harping on how the Catholic Church is so horrible, is so anti-Semitic, because during the Holocaust, the Catholic Church was remiss, to put it mildly, in saving Jews. And the Pope was accused of being the Hitler's Pope. That's controversial, but I'm not going to go into that. So I was saying to him, Mr. Eisen, the Catholic Church is not the problem today. I'm not saying there's no anti-Semitism there. The problem is Jews are being blown up in Israel in their buses, in their stores, in their homes by Islamic terrorists. Now the hatred is coming from there. Jews have to look in all directions. You can't just remember that this was your enemy 50 years ago. The enemy changes. It changes its tune. You can go from right to left, from left to right to center. And we have a big problem because we're seeing anti-Semitism in the media. And anti-Semitism doesn't always mean a cartoon of a Jew depicted as a dog and pulling the reins of the President of the United States to do whatever it wants, which the New York Times had, this, and then they're now getting flack for it, but not enough flack. They should be put out of business. They shouldn't have been able to print the next day. And Stephen, what's his name, the right-wing Zionist who writes there, what's his name? Stevens, yeah, Bret Stephens. He should have resigned. He attacked it, and he's still getting a paycheck from the New York Times. There should have been a much larger, there was a demonstration of 500 people, there should have been 50,000 people demonstrating. You don't get away with reporting, depicting something that fits into the Stürmer, the Nazi newspaper, exact type of cartoons, and say, well, it was a mistake, a terrible mistake. No, it isn't a mistake. It's a pattern, because the next day or day after they did another cartoon, another anti-Semitic cartoon, after they apologized twice. So we have to realize that the hatred is coming from different directions and not try to focus inordinately on one source of it. But the response has to be uniform. Our response is a Jewish response, because anti-Semitism is not just typical racism, bigotry. It's much more than that. It's directed against Jews as Jews. And if we could change our Jewish identity, if we could all shorten our noses, and I mean that figuratively, then it wouldn't be Jews anymore. There would be no anti-Semitism. Although there are people who say that then they'd have to make up some other group to persecute. I don't accept that. I don't accept that at all. Because, of course, people persecuted other groups. I'm not saying we're the only ones that were persecuted, but the consistency, the persistency, the ubiquitous nature of it is unique. And we have to fight it with the same resolve and the same intensity and the same out-of-the-box approach that these horrible people, evil people, do their evil. And the good will prevail. And God willing, we'll soon be together with Mashiach in our land with peace for the whole world. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. So if you ask me, am I optimistic? Yes, very optimistic about the future. But optimism doesn't mean that you're not realistic. You know, a pessimist is not realistic either if he's just pessimistic. Because no one would have believed that the Soviet Union would collapse in the 1990s. The pessimists would say they'd always be around and who knows what they're going to do to the world. They collapsed. The pessimist is not a realist, and an optimist who doesn't see the dangers lurking there is also not a realist. So I think Jews are not optimists or pessimists, but they are poptimists. They have to see the dangers, deal with them, knowing that we're going to prevail. There's no question about it. Yes?